Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week we are looking at technically the oldest paint medium in the world, Casein. Stick around. So what exactly is Casein paint anyway? Casein paint is essentially also known as milk paint. It has been used as far back as ancient Egyptian times, and it is derived from the casein milk protein. It is most similar and comparable as a paint to gouache, although it is more permanent when it dries. So while I'm sure there are some other brands that make it, the most common one, and probably the only one you're going to find, is the Richeson Casein, their Shiva series. So back in January, I was like, okay, I really want to try these. I've been thinking about them for a long time. Went on to Blick's website. There were some color packs, sort of like starter sets and stuff, but I didn't really like the colors that came with them, so I kind of built my own. I've gone with some cadmium red scarlet, some cadmium yellow light, some Shiva blue deep, which is just phthalo blue, and of course titanium white. And over the course of a couple of months here, I've been doing some tests, mixes, stuff like that. Started with a color wheel in particular. I was actually really impressed with the wide range of colors I got out of just my 3 primaries. Pretty nice so far, but there were a number of things I did notice immediately. With any kind of new paint medium, it's important to test things, do what you need to do, and just kind of see what it does. So my immediate first impression was, oh, these paints actually smell a little bit. Well, they're not quite the extreme of oil paint, and not quite the completely neutral and not smelling at all, something like watercolors, acrylics, or gouache. These do have something of an odor to them. It's not necessarily a bad odor, it's just very distinct and very different. The closest thing I could compare it to is some sort of a household cleaner, but without sort of a harsh chemically or vinegar smell. It's almost like Windex, but sweeter. It's the best way I could describe that. So it's not unpleasant, but it is there. I noticed in doing my color wheel and my color tests that almost immediately it was like, oh, this stuff really stains your brushes. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later. The one thing I had heard about Casein is, oh, it's really hard on your brushes. I'm like, well, I'm hard on my brushes now. So, and I don't take care of them as much as I should. Shouldn't be a problem, right? Wrong. Casein is really, really hard on your brushes. Most specifically, and I would say especially so, the blue, which could be said for a lot of paints, but within 5 minutes of working, my bristles were stained and like there was paint buried in them. And I'm like, okay, maybe I don't want to necessarily ruin all my brushes for this. I actually grabbed a brush out of my set and I was like, I'll just pick this one. I have 2 of them. I'm not afraid to ruin it. I was wrong. I was very wrong about that. Well, I did end up using that brush for my second test, which I did a couple of days ago. It was like, I'm just going to get a whole separate brush pack so I can ruin those and not ruin my good ones. Another first impression was that the paint does seem to separate in the tube. Now, there are other paints that do this. Oils do it for sure. Watercolors eventually will separate a little bit as well. But these I wasn't expecting to necessarily have that separation issue. The paint itself is sort of a medium-bodied, maybe leans a little towards a soft body. And it's, when you squeeze it out of the tube, it kind of feels a little bit like it might be kind of like acrylics. But it works again a little bit more like watercolors or gouache, so it's kind of a weird middle ground when it comes to the overall thickness of it. Another interesting thing about sort of that thickness is that thickness actually varies a little bit between color. I was actually kind of surprised to see that the paint didn't necessarily have the same viscosity across color to color to color, the way you'd expect out of like literally any other artist grade paint. This stuff, not so much. Another one that surprised me is that this paint dries very quickly. Now you might think, well, you know, acrylics dry really quickly. No, these dry like 4 times faster than acrylics do. It was dry on my palette in about 5 or 10 minutes. Thicker applications took, you know, upwards of like 10, 15 minutes, but it was like, it was dry. And I'm like, whoa! Now what is good thing, at least in the early stages of working with Casein is that as you're working, you can reactivate them with water. So it's a little bit like gouache in that sense, but usually after about a little, couple hours or a day or so, that will then completely dry, and then you won't be able to reactivate it again afterwards. So as you're working, you can re-wet on your palette, but after the fact, you definitely can't. Another thing I noticed that as I was, mixing with water and grabbing different things and thinning out the paint, is that there were some separation issues, which is something that I, again, would not expect out of any kind of artist grade paint. The paint itself, mixing the color, I could see sort of the pigment breaking apart a little bit as I was working, which I'm like, okay, really? I mean, but it's like, should I be mixing with some other kind of medium other than water? But water is sort of the recommended one because it, again, operates a little bit like watercolor in that sense, but it definitely seemed to be kind of separating the pigment from the binder a bit. As it dried, a lot of the brighter, vibrant colors I was getting seemed to dull out and become a little bit visually chalky. Now, this could be just because it dries very matte, but I did find that it was like, oh, this is also another thing I wasn't really expecting out of what is literally labeled as artist grade paint. And as I moved away from my color wheel, I was like, okay, let me really test what this stuff can do. One thing that it actually reminded me a lot of was traditional poster paints and tempera. Craft paints are actually very similar in working quality to these, I've noticed as well. But I'm like, well, what's the difference between those and, the watercolor and the gouache? Well, I would say benefit-wise for the Casein is that specifically you can work thicker. I did a drawdown thickness test with these colors. They don't seem to crack or anything like that, at least not from what I've been able to tell. So they're relatively flexible and versatile. You can work thick and heavy with impasto work, as well as doing thinner brush work and really diluting down the paint. Seems to work okay for knife applications as well. I did this little sunsetty thing, as well as very recently played with them on wood. Just laid that on real thick and did this funny gradient. It retains, brush marks or knife marks if you want it to, or you can just thin it down so it doesn't. And then I was like, okay, let's really push this even farther here. Can it mix with other paints? Actually, yeah, and it mixes really well with like all other paints. I mixed it with both oil and acrylic with really no trouble. I mixed it with watercolor and gouache with no trouble. And I actually grabbed the poster paint tempera and mixed it and found no trouble. And actually that's the one thing that it is the most similar to is poster paint. And at least in terms of the brush feel, it is actually functionally indistinguishable from poster paint in terms of like how it feels on the brush and how it applies to, in this case, paper. But I think it probably applies to any application that you're working with it. Working on it with. So I know you guys won't be necessarily satisfied with just color swatches, which is why I did end up doing this little forest photo study. Fun little project. And this also, my first impressions were several months ago. I decided, like, let's give this stuff another chance. This seems like a lot of negatives. I actually gave the paint to try to my art friend last time we had a studio day. She said basically all of the things that I just said. I was running down the list, and everything she was kind of not necessarily complaining about, but noticing. I'm like, yeah, that's like all of the same notes that I made too. But I was like, okay, let's have another go at this. Let's do an actual painting. Let's not actually just sit here and do color swatches all day, because as fun as that is, it's not necessarily a practical application. So second initial thoughts. One, I found that it works both thick and thin, which as I sort of mentioned earlier, but it definitely is something of note. I mean, you wouldn't normally find a gouache that you can work super thick with, especially not in a cost-effective way. Maybe with acrylic gouache, but that has some other slightly different properties. One thing to note, though, is that even when you thin it out, it is still very opaque. That is, I would say, if you take nothing else away, remember that Casein is a very opaque painting medium. Even thinning out, something like a yellow, which you'd expect to be a little bit more transparent, it still remained a lot more opaque, which is interesting. Definitely lends itself to a more illustrative technique, which is actually partly what Casein was used for prior to the invention of acrylics in the 50s and 60s. Casein was actually used primarily as an illustrative medium, and then acrylics were invented and everyone's like, oh yeah, these are way better. Once again, I do have to bring up that idea of the tube and paint separation with the medium. First thing I did when I squeezed a bit of that red out was get a nice big pool of just loose medium and not actually the paint. I'm continually surprised at how much this paint separates in the tube. Real quick, back to the idea of it being opaque, I did find that it does make glazing a lot more difficult, so it's a lot better for fast, quick layers. Again, similar, think traditional gouache illustration, but of course it also works pretty well for dry brushing as well. Now another thing I noticed, this could be an issue with just the colors I've chosen, but I think it actually might have to do a little bit with pigment load and formulation here, is that a lot of the colors seem to gray out a little bit, especially when mixed with the white. That was something I actually noticed back when I did my comparison between just professional paint, student grade, and craft paint. Craft paint in particular is notorious for like just all the colors sort of graying out a little bit. These colors don't hold as much vibrancy as I'd like, especially when you start mixing in with the white. I also found that just finding my regular chromatic black was difficult. Again, this could be slightly due to the color compatibility and which colors I picked up. Actually kind of wish I may have picked up like a dark brown or a black when I was shopping, just to have that more of a convenience color. Just because mixing that dark with those three primaries just wasn't really practical. Again, that's something I noticed back when I did the craft paint comparison video, is that craft paint had an issue getting a good chromatic black, and these paints actually have that same problem. So with this little painting running in time-lapse, I'm sure you've noticed already that I had started with some of these white bristled synthetic brushes, and almost immediately they got stained blue, like really, really fast, and that just stuck in the bristles the entire time I was painting. Almost to a degree where even when I rinsed the brush really well in water and went back into white, there was still blue in the brush because of that staining, which makes mixing new colors a little bit more difficult. And sort of the final thing I noticed, again, this could have something to do with the fact that they're drying to be more of a matte color or a matte finish, and I'm used to my acrylics, which have, well, a little bit of a range in terms of matte versus gloss, but I tend to notice that, especially in like blues and cool colors, at least in acrylics, you get a more richer depth of color. You get way more of those dark darks, and that just wasn't there. While it works, it definitely has sort of that almost storybook illustration kind of vibe. I think maybe doing more character work versus more landscape work, even portraiture probably would look a little bit better. But I was lacking a lot of that rich color depth that I'm used to. Whether that be with acrylics, oils, or watercolors, I just did not really find that possible with these paints. So with doing this little mini painting, I had a couple of just overall takeaways. Most notably that, again, we're looking at similar effects that are really possible with gouache and tempera. So I think between those two other mediums, those are the most comparable. I do think because there is some like next day permanence to these, I think they could actually be a great underpainting medium to then go back on top of them with watercolors or gouache, respectively. I think in that sense they could be really useful, especially for maybe something like plein air painting. Like go out in your environment, do a quick study, bring it back to your studio, and then get that richer glaze and depth of color with another medium on top of that. Although I haven't actually tried that yet, so I can't exactly say which layering would be best or if an isolation coat would be needed. And finally, once again, they are super hard on your brushes. Even after rinsing with soap and water, which simple cleanup for that, there was still some distinct deep staining in those bristles. I actually had to break out some mineral spirits to really get those brushes clean. Now that isn't to say that you have to use mineral spirits every time, but if you want to avoid heavy staining and having a lot of that paint just live in your brush permanently, you definitely need to give them a heavier scrub with a more considerable solvent in that sense. So yeah, break out the mineral spirits like last cleaning, but just in between you can kind of just stick with soap and water. In that sense though, having a separate set of brushes is, I would say, is an absolute must. So if you're thinking about picking these up, don't just grab whatever brushes you already have. Get a pack of brushes just to use for these, because they will probably screw up the ones you already have for your other media. Alright, so I know what you're thinking. I feel like that's a lot of negative. I'm not usually that hard on a painting medium, but there's got to be some pros and cons, right? Mostly cons at this point, but what are these paints actually good for? On the good side of things, they actually do have a very pleasantly aesthetic, velvety matte finish. They do look nice. I mean, even after finishing my little landscape study, I'm like, this looks really good. I'm probably going to have to sign this and throw it in my pile of stuff to sell, because it does look really nice. Despite my complaints about brush staining and separation, the paints themselves are actually really, really easy to work with. They have some of the easiest sort of pick up and go ability, whether you're starting with a little stay wet palette or something on the traveling, just grabbing these for the first time. They're easy to work with, whether you're doing, again, more thinned out applications or thicker applications. They do work considerably well. As mentioned with my intermixability and other color swatch tests, they are versatile. You can mix them with other colors and other paints and other types of paints, which is something that you probably would not be able to do with other paints. Like, I couldn't even imagine trying to mix an oil and an acrylic together. That's just not practical. But you can put these into oil paint and they work. And finally, overall, I would say, again, like, these could be great for plein air and just doing little practice pieces. If you don't want to drag out a whole set of oils or something, these could be a really good sort of in-between medium for when you're just trying to figure out an idea before you take it to something like oil, acrylic, watercolor, or gouache. Now, to condense down all of the negatives that I found with this stuff, I would say the first one is just simply, yeah, it's going to be hard on your brushes. It's going to stain them. These bristles were white, and within one painting session, they are stained totally blue, as if I had been using this brush for a year. Another thing specifically with the Richeson's line is the color selection. There's actually not a lot of colors available, so if you're used to looking into a paint line that has maybe 50, 60 colors, these I think have like maybe 25 or 30. There's just not a lot of options out there, so it's a lot of just really basic core colors, which are fine, but I do like a little extra variety for something a little bit off. So like a turquoise or like a red oxide or something that isn't just like that pure primary. I'd be looking for that in any kind of paint, honestly. Once again, there's a little bit of variable viscosity here. Just straight on the tube with these 4 colors. Some of them were a little bit thinner, some of them were a little bit thicker. I think that might have something to do with maybe the pigment and binder not being milled correctly. But it felt a little off. And the final con, and something that I do think I'm going to mention again here in a couple minutes, is that for the money, 4 individual tubes of these, they don't do anything better than any other paints. You can get either gouache or tempera or acrylics or any other type of paint is going to be more cost effective and do the exact same thing that these do for less money. So with all these tests, all these pros and cons, is the Casein paint, specifically the stuff from Richeson, actually worth buying? No, it's not. Honestly, if you like this stuff, good for you. I'm sure there will be some Casein lovers in the comments being like defending this to the ends of the earth, but I don't know. I could not find any major benefit to using this stuff. As I mentioned somewhere in the middle of this earlier, when acrylics were invented, these fell out of practice, globally, pretty much. And the reason for that is they're just not as good as the competition. Yes, they are, technically speaking, the oldest painting medium in the world. But it's just... There's no reason to go out of your way to get these when a $2 bottle of Timbra paint already exists. The brush feel, the working properties, the ability to work it thin or thick can be done in a $2 bottle, where this was like $9 a tube. That's too much money for the exact same result. And you got to admit, when somebody like me who notoriously hates cheap bottled paints like this is like, yeah, this isn't worth it, get this, that's a problem. So, of course, this is the point in the video where I ask you guys of your opinions. Have you heard of Casein paint? Have you tried it? Am I completely wrong? I'm really curious your thoughts. I did my best with this stuff, but honestly, personally, I found that while it was fun to try, short of maybe some mixed media projects, I'm probably never going to touch this stuff again. It works. It is a painting medium. It is an option for artists, but I don't think it's a cost-effective option. I don't think it's worth getting a whole bunch of these because they're not great. They don't do anything interesting enough for me to warrant using them on a regular basis. If I want, you know, a matte finished look to a piece without sacrificing, you know, color depth and quality, I'm going to use gouache or gouache, more specifically. Not to say or watercolor, but watercolors are going to be thinner and transparent. Or I could use acrylic gouache. Golden has their new So Flat matte acrylics out. I haven't used those because I personally have no use for matte finished paints, period, but you know, then there's gouache. But when I use gouache, I mix them with watercolor most of the time. So it's like I just can't find any benefit for you guys to try these. There are options out there. I hope you guys enjoyed the demo, but yeah, I don't know. I normally try to be more positive with reviews and stuff, but I literally cannot think of any good reason to buy these. Well, all of that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I knew it ran a little bit long, but I had a lot to say here. This was such a wild experience, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, and or learned something, hit the like button. Get subscribed if you're not already. Maybe I'll do a follow-up to this if I get enough comments, people telling me I used these wrong or something. But yeah, that's about it. At least I had fun, though. That's the important part. If you're not having fun, you're not really making art, and you're not really doing what you love. Thanks, guys, for watching. Keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time. God, this was so rambly and weird.